Part 1. What it was really like to pioneer on the Oregon Trail. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something simple. Nothing too flashy. Just thousands of people voluntarily walking 2,000 miles in uncomfortable shoes while dragging squeaky wagons across dust, rivers, and deserts. Relax, take a deep breath. Dim the lights, because tonight we're floating back into the 1840s, back to the Oregon Trail. And don't worry, there will be no sudden jump scares, no dramatic battle cries, and absolutely no whooping adventure soundtrack. This is not that kind of story. Instead, it's a long, flat, mildly depressing journey full of broken wheels, dried-out bread, awkward family arguments, and the occasional death by dysentery. So, the perfect bedtime topic. Now the Oregon Trail, the actual historical one, not the pixelated game where you inevitably die before making it past Wyoming, was basically the original road trip. Except the road was more like a suggestion. The trip took half a year and there were no rest stops, just dirt, grass, and the vague promise that if you didn't die first, maybe you'd get to grow some wheat in Oregon. Let's set the scene. It's the early 1840s. The United States hasn't yet figured out where it ends. Manifest destiny, that convenient excuse to take as much land as humanly possible, is catching on. And people, being people, hear the rumors. Rumors of Oregon. A place with endless farmland, mild weather, and allegedly a paradise free from disease and mosquitoes, which was a lie. But they believed it anyway, because what else were they going to do in Missouri? So families started selling everything. Their farms, their tools, sometimes even their last good pair of boots. They'd buy a wagon, stock it with supplies, and line up in Independence, Missouri, waiting for spring grass to grow high enough to feed their oxen. Because yes, your entire cross-continental survival plan depended on grass, which feels like a metaphor, but really isn't. And then they left, heading west, slowly, painfully, at about 2 miles per hour, which means if you're trying to picture it, you could walk alongside the wagon, zone out completely, stare at a rock for 6 hours, and still not fall behind. Thrilling pace. Now let's talk wagons, because Hollywood has ruined this for everyone. When you think of the Oregon Trail, you probably imagine those big Conestoga wagons with curved canvas tops, the kind of thing you'd see in a John Wayne movie. Yeah. No, those were way too heavy. Pioneers weren't out here trying to drag the Titanic across Kansas. They mostly used small prairie schooners, basically glorified wooden carts with thin canvas covers, light enough to move, also light enough to break. Frequently, inside the wagon, you didn't really ride. That was reserved for the sick or the toddlers who couldn't walk 15 miles a day without collapsing. Most adults trudged along beside it day after day, staring at the horizon. And what was inside the wagon? Supplies, not plush bedding, not nice couches. Just barrels of flour, bacon packed in salt, dried beans, coffee, and maybe, if you were feeling fancy, a tin of cinnamon or sugar. No one was hauling fine china. You couldn't even bring too much clothing because you needed the space for food, which meant by the end of the journey, everyone looked equally terrible, equally dirty, and equally regretting their life choices. And speaking of food, let's just gently crush the fantasy right now. This was not a picnic. Trail food was bland, repetitive, and somehow still stressful. The pioneer diet was basically bread made from flour and water, beans boiled until tasteless, bacon that may or may not be mostly salt, and coffee so strong it could wake a corpse. That's if you were lucky. If you weren't, you ran out of bacon by Nebraska and ate whatever you could find. Wild berries, roots, sometimes even dried buffalo dung used as fuel. when firewood ran out. Delicious. So already you've got sore feet, repetitive food, and squeaky wheels. But here's the real fun part. Health. Or more accurately, the absolute lack of it. You've probably heard the Oregon Trail meme about dying of dysentery. That was not a joke. It was a statistical reality. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, they were everywhere. Imagine a caravan of hundreds of people, all sharing the same limited water sources, all trudging through dust, and all occasionally stepping in things that shouldn't be stepped in. Sanitation was not exactly cutting edge, and once disease spread, it spread fast. Burials along the trail were so common that some wagons had to roll right over fresh graves. And in case you're wondering, no, they didn't have time for poetic gravestones. Most were just shallow holes with a pile of rocks on top to discourage wolves. Comforting. But let's not get too dark yet. Let's drift back to the lighter miseries like river crossings. Because if there's one thing pioneers feared more than disease, it was trying to get a wagon across a river. There were no bridges. You either floated it, forded it, or drowned trying. And oxen, bless their big stubborn hearts, were not graceful swimmers. Many a wagon tipped, spilling flour and bacon into the current. Somewhere out there in the Platte River, there's probably still 1846 bacon perfectly preserved by salt. Weather, of course, added its own flair. On the plains, the sun scorched you. In the mountains, snow trapped you. Rain turned the trail into mud, so deep wagons sank up to their axles. Thunderstorms spooked oxen, sending entire teams bolting. Tornadoes, why not? Hailstorms, sure, imagine. Walking 15 miles in wet shoes, eating cold beans, while hail the size of walnuts slaps you in the face. That's Oregon Trail realism. And then there was boredom. Endless, crushing boredom. The human brain can only handle so much staring at flat prairie grass. People tried singing, telling stories, or playing simple games while walking. Some kept diaries, which is why we know so much about how boring it was. One entry literally says, "Nothing happened today except dust." Another, "Still walking, feet hurt." Pulitzer material, but boredom had a cruel twist. Because while nothing was happening, everything was still happening. Wheels cracked, axles snapped, oxen limped, babies cried, people argued, and when one wagon had trouble, the whole train had to stop. Days could be lost to a single repair. And if you couldn't fix it, you abandoned the wagon right there on the trail, which is why later pioneers described seeing the path littered with broken wheels, discarded furniture, and even graves. A breadcrumb trail of failure. Of course, not everyone was equal out there. Social dynamics mattered. Some groups had well-organized leaders, strict schedules, and decent cooperation. Others, not so much. Picture a bunch of stubborn farmers who all think they're in charge, arguing about which way to go. That usually ended with them lost in Wyoming, wasting days trying to decide whether this mountain was the right mountain. Spoiler, it usually wasn't. And then, looming over it all, was the calendar. Because if you didn't make it through the mountains before snow, congratulations, you were now trapped. And being trapped in the mountains in winter meant either starving or, in very rare cases, pulling a Donner Party. And nobody wanted to be that group, so that's the gentle rhythm of the Oregon Trail. Walk, eat beans, fix a wheel, cross a river, bury someone, walk again, over and over, for months, until hopefully you staggered into the Willamette Valley, thinner, weaker, and probably never wanting to eat bacon again. But let's not end part one just yet. let's glide back to where it all began. The motivations. Why did people even do this? For some, it was simple economics. Land in the East was getting crowded, expensive, and not particularly good. In Oregon, you were promised acres upon acres of fertile farmland, free for the taking. At least free if you ignored the native people who had lived there for thousands of years, which of course the government did. For others, it was about starting over. Failed business, broken family ties, scandal back home. The trail was basically the 1840s version of moving to another country and reinventing yourself. Except instead of sipping espresso in Paris, you were dying of cholera in Idaho. And for many, it was religious. Groups like missionaries saw Oregon as the next frontier to spread Christianity, which is poetic in a way, since the pioneers themselves often needed divine intervention just to survive another day without breaking an axle. So motivations varied, but the result was the same, a long line of wagons, stretching westward, crawling, slowly toward an uncertain future. A human river of hope, desperation, and maybe a little bit of denial. And that's where we'll leave off for tonight's beginning. We've set the stage. The wagons are rolling, the bacon is salted, the oxen are already regretting their lives, and the endless dust of the Oregon Trail stretches ahead. In the next part, we'll shuffle along with them, through the Platte, River Valley into the harsh Wyoming plains, and eventually the dreaded Rocky Mountains. All at the thrilling pace of 2 miles per hour. 2 miles per hour. Part 2, Dust, Disease, and the Long Platte River. So the wagons are rolling, the oxen are trudging, and the pioneers, already a little sunburned and cranky, are about to discover what it really means to follow the Platte River across Nebraska. The Platte, if you've never seen it, is not exactly a majestic river. It's wide, shallow, and kind of a muddy mess. Early travelers described it as being a mile wide and an inch deep, which is only slightly exaggerated. Basically, imagine trying to drink from a giant puddle that tastes like wet dirt. That's your main water source for hundreds of miles, refreshing. But the Platte Valley was still the best option. It was flat, it had grass, and grass meant food. For your animals, which meant by extension food for you, because no oxen, no progress. So wagon trains hugged the Platte, stretching out for miles in long, dusty lines. And let's talk about dust, because dust was basically the Oregon Trail's unofficial mascot. Dry winds blew it constantly, wagons rolled over it, oxen churned it up, and every step of every boot sent more into the air. Travelers described it coating everything: hair, clothes, food, teeth. At the end of the day, you'd lie down with a mouth full of grit and wonder why you didn't just stay in Missouri. And then you'd wake up and do it all over again. Of course, dust had a companion, flies, swarms of them, buzzing endlessly, landing on your face, your food, and most annoyingly, your oxen. Because nothing says peaceful journey like a cloud of flies trying to drive your animals insane while you're already halfway insane yourself. But beyond dust and flies, the Platte brought something worse. Disease. Remember that shallow, muddy water? Yeah, everyone drank from it, and everyone's animals waded through it, which made it basically the 19th century version of a germ cocktail. Cholera outbreaks hit wagon trains like a hammer. One day your neighbor seemed fine. The next, they were doubled over, dehydrated, and gone. The death rate was so high in the 1849-1850 cholera epidemics that entire stretches of the trail were lined with shallow graves. Some travelers wrote about seeing dozens of burials in a single day. And since wood was scarce for coffins, most bodies were just wrapped in blankets or clothing, buried quickly, and marked with a pile of stones, which the wolves and coyotes, by the way, often scattered. So, yes, unsettling bedtime thought, but let's drift away from death for a moment and float over to the more mundane challenges, like walking, lots and lots of walking, because despite the Hollywood image of pioneers bouncing along happily in their wagons, the reality was that most people walked nearly the entire 2,000 miles. Wagons were packed tight with supplies, and riding in one was so bumpy it felt like being shaken inside a wooden box. So unless you were sick or pregnant, you walked. Day after day, mile after mile, feet swelled, boots wore out, blisters formed. Some people wrapped their feet in rags when shoes gave out entirely. And remember, this was before the golden age of cushioned sneakers. You were basically walking across America in stiff leather. Cozy. Then there was the schedule. Wagon trains usually started moving at dawn, which meant someone had to get up even earlier to gather oxen, cook a quick breakfast, and pack everything back into the wagon. Then the train rolled on until midday, when there'd be a short stop for food, water, and rest. After that, more walking until sunset. Camp set up again. Fires lit. Dinner cooked. And if you were lucky, a few hours of fiddling or storytelling before collapsing into a bed of blankets. Then up again the next morning. Rinse, repeat for 5 to 6 months. And the monotony was deceptive, because while every day felt the same, the dangers were everywhere, not just disease but accidents. Wagons were heavy, oxen were unpredictable, and people were tired. Runovers were surprisingly common, a child stumbling under a wheel or someone tripping near a moving team. Bones broke easily, and there wasn't much you could do except splint it and hope. Gun accidents also happened. Pioneers carried rifles, partly for hunting, partly for the vague sense of protection, but safety rules were, let's say, loose. Tired, dusty, inexperienced people carrying loaded guns. You can imagine the results. Diaries mention accidental discharges, sometimes fatal. The kind of thing that makes you shake your head and mutter, "Classic Oregon Trail." Now let's float a little further west. By midsummer, wagon trains were pushing through central Nebraska and into the harsher landscapes of Wyoming. The Platte River forked, the grass thinned, and the real grind began. Water sources became unreliable. The sun scorched during the day, and nights could drop cold. People started tossing belongings along the trail just to lighten their loads. Heavy furniture, spare clothes, even heirlooms. Later travelers described seeing the road littered with abandoned items, as if a giant moving sail had exploded across the prairie. And all the while, tensions grew inside wagon trains. Remember, you're stuck with the same group of people for months, walking, eating, and camping together. And not everyone agreed on how things should be run. Some wanted longer travel days, others wanted more rest. Some insisted one route was faster, others swore it would get you killed. Arguments broke out over leadership, over pace, even over where to cross rivers. Small disagreements, magnified by fatigue, sometimes split wagon trains entirely. Families would peel off, joining other groups or striking out on their own, which, as you might guess, usually didn't end well. But of course it wasn't all dust and misery. Occasionally, there were moments of beauty. Diaries talk about endless fields of wildflowers in Nebraska, the sight of distant mountains after weeks of flat prairie, or cool evenings when the campfire smoke drifted up into a starlit sky. There were births along the trail, weddings even. Humans, being humans, still found ways to celebrate. Even if, 5 minutes later, someone was yelling because the oxen wandered off. And then there was the matter of buffalo. At the time, millions roamed the Great Plains. Great shaggy herds that stretched for miles, moving slowly across the horizon. For pioneers who had never seen such animals, it was awe-inspiring. But it was also a hazard. Buffalo could block the trail for days. Wagons had to wait as entire herds thundered past. Sometimes people tried hunting them, which occasionally worked, but more often resulted in wasted bullets and near-death experiences. Meanwhile, the trail itself grew more and more worn. By the 1850s, so many wagons had passed that multiple ruts formed. In some areas, you can still see them today. Deep grooves carved into rock by iron wagon wheels. A physical reminder of just how many feet oxen and wagons made the same slow, grinding journey. By the time pioneers reached Wyoming, fatigue had set in. Supplies were running low, people were thinner, clothes more ragged, tempers shorter. And looming ahead were the Rocky Mountains, the true test. Get through them before snow and you might survive. Get stuck, and well, let's just say you'd wish you hadn't. But before we climb into the mountains, let's pause here in the high plains. The Platte behind us, the endless horizon ahead, dust in our teeth, sore feet in our boots, bacon supplies already looking questionable. The Oregon Trail was no game, no quick jaunt. It was months of relentless plodding, with hope the only thing keeping people moving west. And in the next part, we'll follow them into the Rockies. Slowly, carefully, watching as optimism clashes with reality in the thin mountain air. Part 3 into the Rocky Mountains. So here we are. Nebraska's flatlands are mostly behind us. Wyoming's endless empty spaces stretch ahead. And now, after months of walking, the pioneers start to see the faint, jagged outline of the Rocky Mountains on the horizon. And at first, they're excited. Mountains! Finally, something to look at that isn't grass or dust. Imagine trudging for weeks across open plains, only to finally glimpse peaks in the distance. People wrote about feeling thrilled, hopeful, like maybe, just maybe, they were halfway there. Of course, that optimism didn't last. Because mountains are not just pretty background scenery. They are big, rocky walls between you and your supposed land of milk and honey in Oregon. And no matter how hopeful you feel, you still have to get wagons over them, which is kind of like trying to drag a piano up a staircase made of boulders. The approach to the Rockies followed the Sweetwater River, winding gradually upward. And, fun fact, this was one of the more scenic stretches of the trail. Towering rocks, cool streams, dramatic cliffs, the kind of thing you'd see on a postcard today. Except the pioneers didn't have postcards. They had sore feet and dwindling bacon, and dwindling bacon. And the most famous landmark on this stretch was Independence Rock, a huge granite outcrop rising out of the plain like a giant loaf of bread. Pioneers loved it, mostly because it meant they were on schedule. If you reached Independence Rock, why, the 4th of July you were in good shape. Any later, and you risked hitting the mountains too late in the season, so naturally people carved their names into the rock. Thousands of names. It became a 19th century guestbook of exhaustion and optimism. Hi, we made it this far. Hopefully we don't die in the next 1,000 miles. After Independence Rock came South Pass. Now South Pass was the reason the Oregon Trail existed at all. Without it, wagons probably couldn't have made it over the Rockies. It was a broad, gentle gap, wide enough for a caravan to cross without needing to dismantle wagons or climb sheer cliffs. In trail diaries, South Pass almost comes across as anticlimactic. After weeks of fearing the mountains, they just walked over. No snow-capped peaks, no dramatic cliffs, just a gradual rise and a gentle descent, almost disappointing. But don't relax too much, because South Pass was only the beginning. Once through, you were still in the middle of nowhere. Wyoming's landscape stretched out. Dry, windswept, often barren. Grass grew sparse. Water sources were scattered, and often alkaline, leaving both humans and animals sick. This was the kind of water that looked fine but tasted like it had been filtered through a chalkboard. People drank it anyway because what else were they going to do? And here's where the animals started suffering. Oxen grew thin, cattle dropped dead from exhaustion, horses fared even worse. Some wagon trains resorted to eating their draft animals when supplies ran low, which is a sure sign your trip is not going as planned. Meanwhile, humans were also breaking down. The trail wore on the body in ways that didn't always make it into dramatic retellings. Constant sun led to blistering burns. Cold nights caused aching joints. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making people more vulnerable to every passing disease. The young and old struggled the most. Children often walked barefoot after shoes wore out, while the elderly simply couldn't keep up. And there was no real safety net. If you fell behind, you risked being left behind. Accidents didn't stop either. In fact, they often increased in the mountains. Wagons tipped on uneven ground. Animals stumbled on rocks. And then there were the river crossings, because yes, the rivers kept coming. The Sweetwater, the Green, the Snake. Each had to be forded or floated. Each claimed wagons, supplies, and occasionally lives. Picture trying to float a wooden wagon across a fast river while clinging to oxen that have absolutely no interest in participating. Not exactly a relaxing afternoon swim, but maybe the most frustrating part of the Rockies wasn't the terrain. It was the pace. You've been walking for months. You're thin, tired, cranky. And yet you're still only covering maybe 15 miles a day. Sometimes less. You could practically crawl faster. Every landmark you reach just reminds you how much farther there still is to go. One diarist wrote, "We are all worn out with fatigue, and yet the road stretches endlessly before us," which honestly sums up the Oregon Trail in one sentence. Still people pressed on. They sang to keep spirits up. They told jokes, even if the jokes were bad. They cooked whatever food they had left, sometimes grinding dried buffalo dung into flour, when real flour ran out. They kept diaries, leaving behind the quiet, matter-of-fact accounts that make this story so oddly soothing to read today. Nobody wrote. It was thrilling. They wrote, broke a wheel, repaired it, ate beans, continued, which is, in its own way, comforting. By late summer, wagon trains were descending from the Rockies toward Idaho, which sounds like progress, and it was. But Idaho had its own challenges: dry deserts, rugged terrain, hot days and freezing nights, and of course, more rivers, always more rivers, but we'll save Idaho for a bit later. For now, let's linger in the Rockies. The Great Divide. A place where pioneers felt both accomplished and exhausted. They had made it through the highest barrier. They were technically on the downhill stretch. And yet, Oregon still felt impossibly far away. The trail behind them was littered with broken wagons, abandoned belongings, and shallow graves. The trail ahead was uncertain. And the only thing they could do was keep walking, one slow mile at a time. So let's rest here for tonight. At the edge of South Pass, the sky wide, the mountains fading behind, the endless plains stretching forward, and somewhere far, far ahead, a promise of Oregon that may or may not live up to the hype. Part 4, Idaho, Starvation, and the Columbia River, Gamble. So, the Rockies are technically behind us. You'd think that would feel like progress. But for pioneers, reaching Idaho wasn't so much a reward as it was Well, another several hundred miles of walking through yet another landscape that wanted to kill you. Idaho wasn't lush farmland, at least not the parts the trail crossed. It was dry, rugged, lonely, and depending on the season, either blistering hot or bitterly cold. Travelers wrote of endless sagebrush, sharp volcanic rock, and miles of desert that made oxen collapse in the dust. After weeks of climbing mountains, now they got to enjoy the luxury of trudging across baking flats with almost no water. Because variety is the spice of life, and water, or the lack of it, became one of the greatest challenges here. Springs were few and far between. Rivers ran low or alkaline. Some pioneers wrote of walking 20 miles or more without finding a drinkable source. For animals, it was worse. Oxen grew gaunt. Horses collapsed. People sometimes woke to find half their team dead, which left them scrambling to bargain with other families or abandon their wagons entirely. Food supplies, too, were running dangerously thin by Idaho. Remember, the trip took 4 to 6 months. Even the most careful planning couldn't guarantee enough bacon and flour to last. Diaries often note rations shrinking, 1 biscuit for dinner, a handful of beans, maybe a cup of coffee if you were lucky. Some resorted to foraging. Roots, berries, whatever could be found. Others turned to hunting, but game was increasingly scarce along the trail. Buffalo herds had thinned, scared off by constant migration. Deer and elk weren't always in reach, which left pioneers staring longingly at their skeletal oxen, wondering how long until emergency beef became a reality. And let's not forget the Snake River. The trail followed it for a long stretch, and pioneers had a love-hate relationship with it. On one hand, it meant water. On the other, it meant constant danger. The river was fast, treacherous, and lined with sharp rocks. Crossing it could mean losing wagons, animals, or lives. Some tried to float their wagons on makeshift rafts. Others drove oxen straight in, hoping they'd swim. Results were mixed. One account describes an entire wagon tipping mid-crossing, spilling everything, food, tools, bedding, into the rushing water. The families scrambled out alive but lost all their supplies. Imagine walking another 400 miles with no food, no bedding, and nothing but whatever the neighbors were willing to share. If there was ever a moment when regret hit hard, this was it. Idaho also had another hazard, the landscape itself. Sharp lava rock shredded wagon wheels. Dust storms blinded travelers. At night, freezing winds swept across the plains, and by this point, everyone was already thin, tired, and worn down to the bone. Arguments in wagon trains grew sharper here. People were hungry, desperate, and running out of patience. Some groups split up entirely. Others pushed on in silence, saving their breath for the next miserable climb. And yet, amid the misery, there were still moments of strange beauty. The Shoshone Falls on the Snake River, later nicknamed the Niagara of the West, stunned travelers. They wrote about the roar of water cascading down cliffs, a brief reminder that not everything on the trail was hardship. Of course, right after admiring the falls, they usually had to bury another ox, so the magic didn't last long. By the time pioneers staggered into eastern Oregon, many were barely hanging on. And here came the final insult, the Columbia River. Now, the Columbia wasn't just another river. It was the final gauntlet. The last major obstacle between the exhausted pioneers and the green farmland of the Willamette Valley. And it was brutal. The river was wide, cold, and dangerously fast. Rapids tore through narrow gorges, Boats weren't exactly available on demand, so many families had to build their own makeshift rafts or rent space on rickety ferries. Oxen, of course, had to swim, which rarely went well. The most dreaded section was the Columbia River Gorge. Sheer cliffs on either side, water crashing violently through the middle. For people who had spent months trudging across open plains, the gorge felt terrifying. Wagons lashed to rafts sometimes tipped or smashed against rocks. Supplies vanished. In seconds, people drowned. It was, in many ways, the deadliest part of the journey. Part so deadly, in fact, that some pioneers refused to risk it. Instead, they took the Barlow Road, a rough overland route cut through the Cascades, which sounds safer until you realize it involved dragging wagons up and down steep, forested mountains, sometimes using ropes and pulleys to lower them down cliffs. Families spent days inching forward, oxen groaning, ropes snapping, and tempers fraying. It was technically safer than the river, but only barely. Either way, by the time pioneers reached the Willamette Valley, they were wrecks. Clothes tattered, bodies gaunt, supplies gone. Some families arrived with nothing but the clothes they were wearing. Others limped in missing half their group. And yet they had made it, or at least they had arrived. Whether Oregon lived up to their dreams was another story. Some found fertile farmland and started new lives. Others discovered the climate wasn't the paradise they'd been promised. Winters were damp, crops weren't always reliable, and tensions with native tribes were constant. But compared to months of eating beans and burying oxen, Oregon still felt like relief. And so ended the Oregon Trail journey. For some, it was a triumph. For others, it was simply survival. And for many, it was never completed at all. But the legacy of the trail lingered. Ruts carved into stone. Names etched into Independence Rock. Journals filled with matter-of-fact lines like "wagon broke, buried child, ate beans." Quiet records of one of the hardest road trips in American history. And that really is what the Oregon Trail was. Not a grand adventure, not a glorious expedition, just an endless grinding walk west. Dust, disease, death, and the faint hope that maybe life would be better at the other end. So tonight, as you drift off, picture it, a line of weary families walking behind squeaky wagons, stars overhead, dust underfoot, moving westward one slow mile at a time, because what else could they do really?